Water determined survival in southern Mesopotamia. In the broad alluvial plain formed by the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, communities lived within an environment defined by seasonal flooding, shifting channels, and sediment deposition. By the 6th millennium BCE, these rivers had created a flat deltaic landscape composed of fine silt carried from the Anatolian and Zagros highlands. Geological surveys confirm that the southern plain was not naturally forested and contained few stone outcrops. The ecological conditions of this region established the constraints under which early Sumerian society developed. Archaeological evidence from Eridu, identified with Tel Abu Sharain in southern Iraq, provides some of the earliest material traces of organized settlement in this environment. Excavations conducted in the 20th century revealed successive temple platforms built atop earlier mud-brick structures, indicating long-term occupation beginning in the Ubaid period around 5400 BCE. These settlements were positioned near marshlands and natural levees, slightly elevated areas formed by repeated flooding. Such locations reduced immediate flood risk while preserving access to fertile soil. Records from later Mesopotamian sources describe this region as a land between rivers, but its viability depended on managing unpredictable water levels. Seasonal inundation deposited nutrient-rich alluvium, enabling cereal cultivation, particularly barley, which was more tolerant of saline conditions than wheat. Archaeobotanical remains recovered from Ubaid period layers confirm the cultivation of domesticated grains alongside herding of sheep and goats. However, flooding was neither uniform nor reliable. In years of excessive overflow, settlements risked destruction. In years of insufficient flooding, crops failed. As a result, communities began modifying the natural hydrological system. Archaeologists have identified early canal traces near Eridu and other southern sites, suggesting deliberate diversion of river water for controlled irrigation. The construction and maintenance of canals required coordinated labor beyond individual households. Even small irrigation channels demanded periodic dredging to prevent silting. This necessity likely encouraged cooperative organization at the village level. While no written records survive from this early phase, later Sumerian lexical lists preserve technical vocabulary for canals, ID2, and agricultural fields, ASA, implying that irrigation terminology had deep chronological roots. The institutional memory embedded in later texts indicates continuity between early environmental adaptation and later administrative formalization. The absence of key natural resources further shaped settlement patterns. Southern Mesopotamia lacked accessible timber, building stone, and metal ores. Mud brick, formed from river clay mixed with straw, became the primary construction material. Excavations consistently show standardized mud brick sizes in Ubaid contexts, indicating early architectural planning. For tools requiring harder materials, communities relied on imported stone from northern Mesopotamia and the Iranian plateau. Obsidian fragments discovered at Ubaid sites have been traced through geochemical analysis to Anatolian sources. These findings confirm that even during this early period, exchange networks extended beyond the southern plain. Environmental limitations also influenced subsistence diversity. In addition to cereal agriculture, marsh resources provided fish, reeds, and waterfowl. Faunal remains recovered from Eridu include fish bones and net weights, suggesting organized fishing activity. Reeds were used in housing construction and boat building. Early watercraft, likely reed boats coated with bitumen, enabled navigation along canals and river channels. Bitumen residues discovered at multiple Ubaid sites indicate knowledge of waterproofing techniques. Control over waterways thus facilitated both irrigation and transport. Settlement distribution during the Ubaid period reflects gradual demographic concentration. Survey data show increasing site density in southern Mesopotamia between 5500 and 4000 BCE. Small hamlets clustered near water sources eventually expanded into larger communities. The consistency of temple-oriented architecture at Eridu suggests emerging communal institutions that may have coordinated agricultural cycles and ritual activity tied to seasonal rhythms. Although political kingship had not yet developed, environmental management likely fostered collective leadership structures centered on irrigation oversight and resource allocation. Over time, The interplay between unpredictable flooding and organized canal systems stabilized agricultural output. Controlled irrigation reduced vulnerability to environmental fluctuation and allowed surplus production. Archaeologists have noted that settlement size correlates with proximity to major canal branches, indicating that water management directly influenced urban precursors. By the late Ubaid period, increasing population density and infrastructural complexity marked a transition toward proto-urban organization. The environmental conditions of southern Mesopotamia did not simply provide a backdrop for civilization. They structured its earliest forms of cooperation, resource management, and settlement planning. As irrigation systems improved and agricultural reliability increased, permanent communities expanded in both scale and institutional complexity. Before we continue deeper into the foundations of early Mesopotamian civilization, consider subscribing to the channel and activating notifications. New long-form historical documentaries are released regularly, each structured for chronological clarity and research depth. If you find this exploration valuable, you may also share which section you found most informative. Viewer engagement supports the continued production of academically grounded historical content. Long before kings ruled, temples stood at the center of communal life. During the Ubaid period, roughly 5500 to 4000 BCE, settlements across southern Mesopotamia began to exhibit architectural and social features that suggest organized ritual authority. Archaeological excavations at Eridu provide the clearest evidence of this development. Beneath later monumental structures, archaeologists uncovered a sequence of superimposed temples built on raised mud brick platforms. Radiocarbon dating places the earliest of these structures in the 6th millennium BCE, with repeated rebuilding over centuries. The continuity of sacred space indicates that ritual institutions were already central to community organization. The temples at Eridu follow a tripartite plan, consisting of a central hall flanked by side rooms and oriented toward a cult niche. This architectural pattern became characteristic of later Mesopotamian temple construction. The repetition of this design across multiple levels demonstrates intentional planning rather than ad hoc construction. Offering tables, clay cones, and small altars recovered within these structures indicate sustained ceremonial activity. Although written texts do not survive from this period, the material record confirms that communal ritual was institutionalized centuries before the emergence of documented kingship. Parallel developments appear at other Ubaid sites, including Uruk, and Tel el-Abaid. Survey evidence shows that settlements expanded along canal-fed areas, forming networks of villages linked by waterways. Standardized pottery styles, particularly greenish buff where decorated with geometric motifs, appear across wide regions of Mesopotamia. The uniformity of ceramic production suggests shared cultural practices and possibly centralized oversight of craft specialization. Kiln remains and workshop areas indicate that pottery manufacture was not purely domestic but increasingly organized. Trade connections also expanded during this period. Obsidian artifacts discovered at Ubaid sites have been traced through compositional analysis to sources in eastern Anatolia. Marine shells from the Persian Gulf and bitumen deposits from northern Mesopotamia further attest to interregional exchange. These materials were not locally available in the southern alluvial plain. Their presence indicates that Ubaid communities were integrated into long-distance trade networks well before urbanization. Exchange likely occurred through riverine and coastal routes, facilitated by reed boats sealed with bitumen. This integration broadened the economic base of temple-centered settlements. Archaeologists have also identified evidence of increasing social differentiation. Burial goods from Ubaid cemeteries vary in quantity and quality, suggesting uneven access to resources. Some graves contain ornamental beads and finely crafted pottery, while others are comparatively modest. The presence of larger residential structures alongside smaller dwellings indicates emerging hierarchies within settlements. Although the scale of inequality was limited compared to later periods, these differences point to structured social roles linked to institutional authority. The temple appears to have functioned not only as a ritual center but also as an economic coordinator. Storage rooms associated with temple complexes contain large quantities of grain remains and administrative objects such as clay tokens. These tokens, shaped in geometric forms, are interpreted by many scholars as precursors to accounting systems later formalized in cuneiform writing. Their distribution within temple precincts suggests that surplus agricultural production was collected, stored, and redistributed under institutional supervision. This pattern marks the early development of what historians describe as the temple economy. Labor organization during the Ubaid period likely revolved around seasonal agricultural cycles and communal construction projects. The building and rebuilding of temple platforms required coordinated effort and resource mobilization. Mud brick production, transport, and structural planning imply leadership capable of directing collective labor. While the specific titles or offices of such leaders remain unknown, the archaeological evidence demonstrates that authority was embedded within ritual institutions rather than hereditary monarchy. Governance, at this stage, appears to have been closely intertwined with religious stewardship. Radiocarbon dating and settlement surveys indicate a gradual increase in population density across southern Mesopotamia during the 5th millennium BCE. Smaller villages consolidated into larger communities situated near reliable irrigation channels. This demographic concentration corresponded with expanding temple architecture and greater craft specialization. Records indicate that settlement sizes grew most rapidly in regions with stable canal networks, reinforcing the link between water management and institutional authority. By the end of the Ubaid period, southern Mesopotamia exhibited a pattern of temple-centered communities characterized by standardized material culture, long-distance exchange, and emerging social stratification. These developments established structural precedents for later Sumerian city-states. Institutional authority was rooted in religious architecture, economic coordination, and environmental management rather than dynastic kingship. By the late 4th millennium BCE, increasing settlement density and infrastructural complexity prepared southern Mesopotamia for the transition from large temple communities to fully urbanized city centers. With urban growth came rivalry. By the early 3rd millennium BCE, the large urban experiment of the Uruk period had given way to a landscape divided among autonomous political centers. Southern Mesopotamia no longer revolved around a single dominant metropolis. Instead, cities such as Uruk, Lagash, Kish, and Nippur functioned as independent polities, each controlling surrounding agricultural territories and canal systems. Archaeological surveys indicate that settlement hierarchies became more regionally defined during this period, with secondary towns and villages aligned to specific urban cores. The transition from the Uruk period to the early dynastic era remains the subject of scholarly debate. Excavation layers show localized disruption and reorganization rather than uniform collapse. Monumental building projects continued in several cities, though on a more regionally focused scale. Administrative tablets from Jemdet Nasr and early dynastic contexts demonstrate continuity in accounting practices, suggesting that bureaucratic systems survived even as political authority decentralized. Records indicate that cities increasingly asserted territorial boundaries tied to irrigation networks and arable land. The Sumerian king list, compiled centuries later, provides a retrospective narrative of early rulership. It describes kingship as having descended from heaven and lists antediluvian rulers with extraordinarily long reigns. While these early entries cannot be corroborated archaeologically, later names in the list begin to intersect with historically attested figures. Scholars interpret the king list not as a literal chronicle but as an ideological document designed to legitimize dynastic succession. Its emphasis on successive hegemonies reflects a political culture already conscious of rivalry and shifting dominance. Archaeological evidence confirms the emergence of secular leadership during early dynastic I. The term Lugal, often translated as great man or king, begins appearing in inscriptions. Cylinder seals from this period depict elite figures engaged in ritual and administrative activities, indicating a growing distinction between temple authority and royal power. While temple institutions remained central to economic life, governance increasingly incorporated military and territorial dimensions. The differentiation between ensi, often associated with city governors or priestly rulers, and Lugal suggests evolving hierarchies of authority. Fortification walls constructed around several cities provide material evidence of competition. Excavations at and Uruk reveal defensive structures dating to the early 3rd millennium BCE. These walls were not symbolic. Their scale implies anticipation of organized conflict. Control of canal junctions and levees likely intensified disputes, as irrigation remained the foundation of agricultural survival. Boundary markers and inscriptions discovered near contested zones indicate attempts to formalize territorial claims. Political identity became increasingly tied to urban affiliation rather than broader regional unity. Nippur occupied a distinctive position within this fragmented landscape. Although not always politically dominant, it functioned as a major cult center dedicated to the god Enlil. Control over Nippur carried ideological weight, as rulers who patronized its temples could claim religious legitimacy. This dynamic introduced a new dimension to intercity rivalry. Competition extended beyond land and labor to divine favor. Records indicate that later kings emphasized restoration projects in Nippur as evidence of rightful rule, suggesting that even in this early phase, religious institutions mediated political authority. Economic specialization also reinforced political boundaries. Administrative tablets show that each city managed its own labor force, agricultural quotas, and storage facilities. Redistribution systems remained largely localized. While trade continued between cities, no overarching centralized authority regulated exchange across southern Mesopotamia. The result was a mosaic of self-governing urban centers connected by shared cultural practices yet divided by political ambition. The fragmentation of the early dynastic I period did not signify institutional weakness. On the contrary, localized governance encouraged experimentation in administration and record-keeping. Each city refined its own bureaucratic procedures in response to competition. This environment fostered the development of more formalized taxation, resource allocation, and labor organization. The need to defend territory and assert legitimacy accelerated structural innovation within individual polities. By the end of the early dynastic I period, southern Mesopotamia was characterized by a network of rival city-states, each governed by its own elite leadership and supported by established administrative systems. Urban identity had become the primary framework of political organization. Rivalry over land, water, and prestige shaped the trajectory of Sumerian governance. Competition among these city-states would soon stimulate further administrative refinement and the systematic organization of military forces. Power increasingly rested in those who could record it. During the late 4th and early 3rd millennia BCE, systems of notation that had originated in temple accounting evolved into a structured writing system now known as cuneiform. The earliest tablets from Uruk level 4, dated to approximately 3300 BCE, consist primarily of pictographic signs representing commodities, such as barley, livestock, and textiles. By the Jemdet Nasr period, around 3000 BCE, these signs had become more abstract and standardized, pressed into clay with a reed stylus to produce wedge-shaped impressions. Excavations at Jemdet Nasr and Uruk have uncovered hundreds of administrative tablets documenting grain allocations, labor assignments, and storage inventories. The tablets are often formatted in tabular layouts, indicating systematic accounting procedures. Records indicate that officials tracked incoming and outgoing goods with precision, frequently specifying quantities, recipients, and institutional affiliations. The shift from simple token-based accounting to inscribed clay tablets allowed for more durable and centralized record-keeping. Archaeologists have identified clay envelopes, or bulli, containing tokens that correspond to tablet inscriptions, illustrating a transitional phase in bureaucratic technology. The writing system itself underwent significant transformation during this era. Early pictographs gradually gave way to signs representing syllabic sounds, enabling the recording of personal names and grammatical structures. This phonetic development expanded the scope of writing beyond numerical accounting. By the early dynastic period, inscriptions include titles such as Lugal and references to specific cities. The increasing complexity of signs suggests formal training in sign lists and scribal conventions. Lexical tablets recovered from sites such as Farah, ancient Shuruppak, preserve standardized lists of signs, professions, and commodities, demonstrating structured educational practice. Although direct architectural evidence for scribal schools from this early period is limited, later Mesopotamian texts refer to the Adaba, or tablet house, where scribes were trained. Many scholars argue that the institutional roots of scribal education lie in the Jemdet Nasr and early dynastic administrative environment. The repetition of identical sign forms across distant sites indicates the transmission of standardized training. Writing was not a widespread skill but restricted to a specialized class attached to temples and palaces. Literacy thus functioned as an instrument of institutional authority. Administrative literacy enabled more precise management of agricultural surplus. Tablets record rations issued to laborers, often measured in standardized units of barley. These allocations suggest the presence of dependent workforces organized under institutional oversight. The ability to document quotas and obligations reinforced hierarchical structures within city-states. Records indicate that scribes were responsible for reconciling discrepancies between stored goods and issued rations, implying auditing procedures. Such practices demonstrate that bureaucratic accountability had already become integral to governance. Writing also facilitated early legal and contractual documentation. While comprehensive law codes belong to later periods, fragmentary tablets from the early dynastic era record property transfers and labor agreements. These documents frequently include witness names, reflecting emerging legal formalization. By recording agreements in durable clay, institutions reduced reliance on oral memory and personal testimony. This shift strengthened centralized control over economic and social transactions. Cuneiform's administrative function extended beyond individual cities. Similar sign conventions appear in tablets from Uruk, Lagash, and Kish, suggesting a shared bureaucratic culture across southern Mesopotamia. However, each city maintained its own archival repositories. Excavations have revealed tablet caches stored in designated rooms within temple and palace complexes. The concentration of written records within institutional buildings underscores the close relationship between literacy and centralized authority. The evolution of cuneiform administration transformed governance by embedding economic management in permanent documentation. Authority became increasingly dependent on written verification rather than solely on ritual legitimacy or military strength. The capacity to calculate, record, and retrieve information enhanced the durability of institutional systems. Administrative archives created continuity across generations of officials, preserving precedents and procedural norms. By the end of the early dynastic I period, writing had become indispensable to the operation of city-states. Bureaucratic specialization expanded, and scribal expertise reinforced hierarchical governance. Administrative growth did not occur in isolation. It developed alongside expanding temple institutions and evolving religious structures that shaped civic identity. By the early 3rd millennium BCE, political legitimacy centered on one city, Kish. Located in northern Babylonia near the Euphrates corridor, Kish occupied a strategic position linking southern Sumerian settlements with northern Mesopotamian trade routes. In the aftermath of early dynastic fragmentation, this geographic advantage enabled Kish to exert influence beyond its immediate hinterland. Archaeological and textual traditions indicate that it became one of the earliest cities to claim superregional authority. The Sumerian king list, compiled in the early 2nd millennium BCE but preserving earlier traditions, identifies Kish as the first city to receive kingship after the legendary flood. The text states that kingship descended from heaven to Kish, establishing it as the initial center of dynastic rule in the post-Diluvian age. While the flood narrative itself belongs to mythic historiography, scholars regard the prominence assigned to Kish as reflecting genuine early political significance. The king list structure suggests that later dynasties sought legitimacy by associating themselves with Kish's perceived primacy. Archaeological excavations at Tel el-Uhamer, identified as ancient Kish, support the city's importance during the early dynastic period. Substantial mud-brick fortifications have been uncovered, indicating defensive planning on a scale consistent with regional rivalry. Elite burials discovered within the site contain grave goods such as weapons, ornaments, and finely crafted pottery. These burials imply the presence of a stratified ruling class capable of mobilizing labor and resources. The architectural remains reveal organized urban planning, including residential districts and institutional structures. Among the rulers associated with Kish, The figure of Enmebargese stands out as one of the earliest historically attested monarchs in Mesopotamian history. His name appears not only in the king list but also in later inscriptions, including fragments from Nippur that refer to temple construction. Although direct contemporary inscriptions are limited, the convergence of textual references increases confidence in his historicity, often dated around 2700 BCE. Records indicate that Enmebargese campaigned against Elamite forces to the east, suggesting military activity extending beyond local conflicts. His reign marks one of the earliest intersections between textual tradition and archaeological plausibility. Kish's location along major trade arteries contributed significantly to its authority. The Euphrates served as a conduit for goods moving between northern resource zones and southern agricultural centers. Control of river traffic allowed Kish to regulate access to timber, stone, and metals that were scarce in southern Mesopotamia. Administrative tablets from later periods demonstrate that trade routes passing through Kish connected to regions such as Mari and Ebla. While direct documentation from early dynastic I remains limited, geographic analysis supports the inference that Kish functioned as an intermediary hub. The title King of Kish acquired symbolic prestige that extended beyond the city itself. Subsequent rulers from other polities adopted the designation even when Kish was not under their direct control. This pattern indicates that the title came to represent hegemonic authority rather than simple municipal governance. By claiming to be King of Kish, rulers asserted a form of universal kingship within Sumer. The persistence of this title in later inscriptions demonstrates the lasting ideological weight of Kish's early dominance. Material evidence also suggests that Kish's authority involved diplomatic as well as military mechanisms. Cylinder seals from the early dynastic period depict scenes of tribute presentation and ceremonial exchange. Although the precise political relationships remain unclear, such imagery implies structured interactions among city-states. The consolidation of authority at Kish may have relied on alliances and ritual acknowledgement as much as direct conquest. This model of leadership foreshadows later Mesopotamian practices in which symbolic supremacy accompanied territorial expansion. The rise of Kish did not eliminate the autonomy of southern cities such as Uruk, and Lagash. Rather, it established a framework in which one city could temporarily assert preeminence over others. Archaeological evidence from these southern centers indicates continued independent building programs and administrative activity during the same period. This coexistence suggests that hegemony was fluid and contested rather than absolute. Political supremacy depended on sustained military capability and economic leverage. Over time, the concentration of legitimacy in Kish demonstrated the potential for regional consolidation within a fragmented landscape. However, the absence of durable centralized institutions limited the stability of its dominance. Authority remained closely tied to individual rulers rather than permanent bureaucratic integration across cities. As new leaders emerged in competing polities, the balance of power shifted accordingly. By the mid-3rd millennium BCE, rival city-states in the south began to challenge Kish's prominence, initiating a period of intensified intercity conflict that would reshape the political structure of Sumer. Control of irrigation canals meant control of survival itself. By the mid-3rd millennium BCE, the prosperity of Sumerian city-states depended not merely on fertile soil, but on the intricate web of canals that transformed the alluvial plains into productive farmland. Water from the Tigris and Euphrates had to be diverted, regulated, dredged, and defended. When control over these lifelines became contested, the result was not negotiation alone, but organized violence. The prolonged rivalry between Lagash and Umma stands as the earliest fully documented example of sustained intercity warfare in recorded history. At the heart of their conflict lay a fertile tract of land known as the Guadina, a border region nourished by shared irrigation canals. In an environment where arable land was limited and water unpredictable, this agricultural zone represented wealth, stability, and political leverage. Canal maintenance required coordinated labor. Disruption meant crop failure. When disputes arose over canal rights and boundary demarcations, the economic implications were immediate. Whoever controlled the water controlled taxation, food distribution, and, by extension, political authority. The origins of the conflict likely date to earlier boundary agreements, perhaps arbitrated by a neutral authority such as Kish during its period of prestige. Later inscriptions from Lagash claim that Umma repeatedly violated established border treaties, diverting canals and encroaching upon the Guadina fields. Whether these claims reflect objective reality or Lagashite propaganda cannot be fully determined, but the intensity of the rivalry is unmistakable. Written records preserve not only accusations of trespass, but references to formal arbitration attempts, evidence that legal mechanisms existed alongside military options. By approximately 2600 to 2500 BCE, hostilities escalated into open warfare. Under the leadership of rulers such as Eannatum, Lagash undertook organized military campaigns to assert dominance. The most vivid testimony to this struggle survives in the famous Stele of the Vultures, commissioned by Eannatum around 2450 BCE. Carved in limestone and inscribed in cuneiform, the monument provides a rare visual and textual narrative of early warfare. On one register, tightly ordered ranks of infantry advance in disciplined formation, shields overlapping and spears angled forward. The composition suggests coordination and training rather than spontaneous skirmishing. The imagery indicates that Sumerian warfare had evolved beyond small-scale raiding. Soldiers appear equipped with standardized gear, helmets, large rectangular shields, and spears, implying centralized provisioning. The formation depicted resembles an early phalanx, a tightly packed infantry unit designed for frontal assault. Such organization required command structure, logistical planning, and possibly conscription or standing forces. Warfare had become institutional. Equally significant is the religious symbolism integrated into the stele. In another scene, the city god Ningirsu is shown grasping enemies in a divine net, affirming that victory derived not merely from military strength but from divine sanction. This theological dimension reinforced the ruler's legitimacy. Success in battle was interpreted as proof of cosmic favor. Thus, military triumph translated directly into political authority at home. Inscriptions accompanying the monument describe how Eannatum defeated Umma, re-established the boundary, and imposed oaths under divine witness. The language emphasizes treaty violation and retribution. Rather than presenting the conflict as conquest for expansion alone, the narrative frames it as enforcement of lawful order. This rhetorical strategy reflects an emerging ideology. The king is guarantor of justice and protector of rightful land. Archaeological evidence supports the centrality of irrigation infrastructure in this rivalry. Excavations across southern Mesopotamia reveal extensive canal systems, some kilometers long, requiring continuous dredging and supervision. Canal banks needed reinforcement. Silt accumulation demanded organized labor. Control over these systems provided leverage over agricultural yields and workforce mobilization. Disrupting a rival's canal could devastate harvests without prolonged siege. The conflict between Lagash and Umma therefore illustrates how environmental management became inseparable from military policy. Water rights were not abstract claims. They determined food security. As population densities increased and agricultural specialization expanded, disputes over water intensified. What might previously have been seasonal skirmishes now escalated into multi-generational hostilities. The social consequences were profound. Sustained warfare required administrative coordination, recording rations, distributing equipment, mobilizing labor. This in turn strengthened bureaucratic institutions within the city-state. Military campaigns may have accelerated social stratification, as elites commanded resources and soldiers depended on centralized authority. War reinforced hierarchy. Furthermore, the conflict reveals that early Sumerian polities recognized territorial boundaries. The Guadina was not undefined wilderness. It was demarcated land with established markers and agreed limits. The very act of carving a stele to memorialize a boundary indicates an advanced conception of sovereignty. Territory, law, and military enforcement were interlinked. Yet the victory of Lagash did not end in stability. Subsequent inscriptions suggest renewed hostilities under later rulers. The pattern appears cyclical: treaty, violation, retaliation, renegotiation. No single city-state possessed the capacity to impose lasting regional peace. Instead, Shifting alliances and episodic warfare characterized the early dynastic landscape. The rivalry also highlights the limits of hegemony. Unlike the symbolic dominance once claimed by Kish, Lagash's authority over Umma remained contested and localized. Control of canals secured agricultural zones, but did not guarantee broader regional supremacy. Political consolidation in Sumer remained fragile. From a broader perspective, the Canal Wars mark a turning point in political development. They demonstrate that organized infantry warfare, legal documentation of treaties, and divine legitimation of violence were already integrated by the mid-3rd millennium BCE. Environmental stress did not merely challenge city-states. It catalyzed institutional complexity. Every city was governed not only by kings, but by gods. In Sumerian civilization, religious structures were fundamental to both political authority and social organization. The pantheon comprised deities representing natural forces, celestial phenomena, and civic ideals, forming a hierarchical framework that intertwined cosmic order with human governance. Primary among these were the sky god, Enlil, lord of air and wind, Enki, deity of freshwater, wisdom, and craft, Eanna, goddess of love, fertility, and war, and Nanna, the moon god. Each deity exercised influence over specific domains, establishing a system in which divine favor and cosmic balance were essential to communal prosperity. The cult center at Nippur exemplifies the institutional centrality of religion. As the principal sanctuary of Enlil, Nippur held ritual and ideological significance that extended beyond its immediate urban population. Excavations have revealed extensive temple precincts with layered construction phases, indicating continuous occupation and ceremonial activity from the early dynastic through the Akkadian periods. Administrative tablets from Nippur record offerings of grain, livestock, and craft goods, reflecting both ritual obligation and the integration of temple economy into civic management. Such records suggest that the temple functioned as a focal point of societal coordination, mediating resources between local populations and the divine hierarchy. Cuneiform hymns and temple archives provide detailed insight into Sumerian cosmology and ritual practice. Hymns dedicated to Enlil describe his role as arbiter of order, controlling wind, storms, and the fertility of the land. Enki is frequently invoked in texts concerned with freshwater access, irrigation, and craft knowledge, emphasizing the practical dimension of divine authority. Eanna appears in both erotic and martial contexts, illustrating the dual nature of her influence on civic and military affairs. Moon worship centered on Nanna involved calendrical observations, which informed agricultural cycles and administrative planning. The codification of these deities in written records indicates the complexity of religious literacy and its centrality to governance. Creation traditions such as the Eridogenesis reveal a theological framework linking cosmology to human institutions. The narrative recounts the creation of humankind to relieve the gods of labor, establishing a reciprocal relationship between divine authority and human service. Kingship and temple activity were understood as manifestations of cosmic order, with rulers acting in accordance with divine mandate. This cosmological structure reinforced social hierarchy. Priests, scribes, and administrators were intermediaries who interpreted and executed the will of the gods, while the king coordinated secular and military affairs under religious sanction. Archaeological evidence underscores how religious hierarchy translated into material culture. Temples were constructed on elevated platforms, emphasizing their prominence within urban space. The ziggurat, a monumental multi-tiered structure, exemplifies the fusion of cosmology, urban planning, and social stratification. These edifices required labor organization, resource mobilization, and architectural knowledge, demonstrating the capacity of religious institutions to concentrate authority. Temple precincts included subsidiary shrines, storage facilities, and administrative offices, integrating ritual practice with economic and political management. Ritual cycles structured communal life. Offerings of food, textiles, and craft products followed calendrical patterns aligned with lunar observations. Festivals, such as the sacred marriage ceremony of Eanna and Dumuzi, reinforced both theological and civic cohesion. Inscriptions document processions, sacrificial rites, and symbolic acts designed to maintain harmony between humans and deities. These events provided an arena for elite display, social reinforcement, and redistribution of wealth, further embedding hierarchical structures within daily life. Sumerian cosmology also influenced legal and moral codes. Cuneiform proverbs, omens, and temple decrees framed behavior in terms of divine expectations. Authority was legitimized through the perception that rulers enforced cosmic balance. Deviations from expected conduct, whether in irrigation management, temple offerings, or military action, were interpreted as breaches of divine order, justifying corrective measures. This system provided ideological coherence for both secular and religious governance. The integration of deities into city identity reinforced local authority while supporting superregional cohesion. Each city emphasized patron deities to assert political legitimacy, yet shared recognition of primary gods such as Enlil created a conceptual framework binding multiple polities. Nippur's cultic authority, for example, allowed southern and northern rulers to claim symbolic sanction through participation in temple offerings and restoration projects. Archaeological layers and inscriptions demonstrate that dedication to these deities persisted across political regimes, illustrating continuity of religious centrality in Sumerian society. By codifying the roles of gods, delineating sacred spaces, and institutionalizing ritual practice, the Sumerians created a system in which religion was inseparable from civic administration. The pantheon defined social hierarchy, shaped law, guided agricultural planning, and legitimized military activity. Priests, scribes, and kings operated within a framework in which divine order structured both the cosmos and urban life. Religious belief, materialized through temple construction, cultic archives, and ceremonial performance, became a central mechanism for maintaining social cohesion and political authority. This cosmological structure laid the groundwork for increasingly complex urban organization, linking theology with governance in ways that persisted throughout Sumerian history. Religious authority thus manifested materially and institutionally, setting the stage for subsequent chapters examining the interrelation between divine sanction, architectural achievement, and urban administration. The temple was both sacred sanctuary and economic engine. In Sumerian city-states, religious complexes were more than spiritual centers. They were focal points of economic activity, labor organization, and resource management. Monumental architecture, such as the Eannatum precinct at Uruk and the foundational ziggurats at Ur, reflects substantial investment of materials and labor to reinforce divine legitimacy. These structures symbolize the city's devotion to patron deities while asserting the temple's role as a hub of social and economic control. Archaeological excavations show layered construction phases, indicating repeated expansion and rebuilding, which underscores both religious continuity and the capacity of temples to mobilize organized labor over long periods. Temple complexes administered extensive landholdings and managed large populations of dependent laborers. Administrative tablets recovered from Eannatum record allocations of grain, livestock, and labor, demonstrating centralized oversight of resources. Storage magazines reveal sophisticated inventory systems, with standardized measures for cereals and rations. The integration of economic management into sacred precincts highlights the dual function of temples as both spiritual centers and administrative engines. Clay tokens and early cuneiform tablets indicate meticulous record-keeping, enabling surplus management, redistribution, and taxation. This administrative capacity ensured stability of supply, coordinated workforce deployment, and reinforced the social hierarchy under priestly supervision. The ziggurat foundations at Ur and Eridu further illustrate the interplay between architecture, religion, and economy. Elevated platforms required organized labor, often mobilizing entire communities. Construction relied on standardized mud bricks, coordinated logistics for transporting waterlogged clay, and continuous workforce supervision. These projects were not seasonal or casual. They demanded long-term planning, specialized knowledge, and resource allocation. The physical prominence of ziggurats reinforced the visibility and authority of temple institutions, serving as tangible markers of religious and civic power within the urban landscape. Offering tables, altars, and ritual paraphernalia demonstrate the integration of ceremonial activity with economic oversight. Temples received donations of grain, livestock, and craft products, which were recorded and redistributed. In some cases, artisans worked under temple supervision, producing textiles, pottery, and other commodities for both ritual use and wider economic circulation. The combination of storage, production, and ritual activity indicates that temples functioned as multifunctional centers linking spiritual, economic, and administrative life. Material culture supports the economic centrality of temples. Excavations at Uruk and Lagash reveal magazines with thousands of jars, each carefully labeled, alongside archives of cuneiform tablets documenting transactions, allocations, and labor assignments. These archives indicate that temple administration had evolved beyond simple tribute collection, encompassing sophisticated mechanisms for inventory control, workforce management, and resource distribution. The ability to maintain extensive records demonstrates literacy and numeracy concentrated within the temple bureaucracy, further consolidating institutional authority. Temple economies also facilitated intercity interaction and long-distance exchange. Administrative tablets show that temples organized shipments of goods such as barley, wool, and crafted objects to other settlements, often in connection with religious festivals or political alliances. The mobility of surplus linked economic management to social and religious networks, allowing temple authorities to extend influence beyond their immediate urban center. By controlling the flow of critical commodities, temples reinforced their social and political significance within and between city-states. The dual role of temples in Sumerian society extended into labor organization and social hierarchy. Seasonal agricultural work, canal maintenance, and construction projects were coordinated through temple administration. Tablets record the allocation of rations to workers, indicating formalized dependence on the temple for sustenance. Priests and scribes occupied privileged positions, overseeing both ritual performance and material management. This structure solidified a tiered social order in which religious, administrative, and economic authority were mutually reinforcing. Religious authority also shaped legal and contractual mechanisms within temple complexes. Cuneiform records detail obligations, agreements, and penalties, linking economic transactions to divine oversight. Compliance with temple administration was framed not merely as civic duty but as religious responsibility, embedding the social hierarchy within a framework of cosmic legitimacy. This integration of law, ritual, and economy ensured that temple governance extended into nearly all aspects of daily life, from food production to craft specialization. The continuous maintenance and expansion of temple infrastructure reflect both religious devotion and institutional stability. Rebuilding phases of the Eannatum precinct and ziggurats at Uruk involved systematic planning, including mobilization of labor, material sourcing, and long-term project management. These undertakings required coordination across multiple societal layers, reinforcing the centrality of temples in the political and economic organization of Sumerian cities. As visible symbols of both divine and administrative authority, temples anchored social cohesion and structured civic life around a centralized, sacred institution. By codifying economic activity, supervising labor, and administering resources, temples transformed religious observance into a mechanism of societal regulation. This dual function made the temple indispensable to urban stability, linking theological legitimacy to material management. Religious authority, therefore, was not an abstract principle. It was enacted through tangible economic structures that shaped production, distribution, and labor relations. Through architectural investment, meticulous record-keeping, and control of surplus, temple economies institutionalized power in Sumerian city-states. They became central nodes connecting spirituality, social hierarchy, and material sustenance. These complexes laid the groundwork for subsequent urban development, demonstrating that the consolidation of religious, economic, and administrative functions was essential to the growth and resilience of early Sumerian civilization. Religious authority, exercised through temple management and monumental construction, thus defined daily life, established social order, and reinforced the legitimacy of both priestly and secular elites. Sumer's wealth began in the fields, measured in barley and water. By the early dynastic period, the prosperity of city-states like Uruk, Lagash, and Uruk depended on the systematic management of irrigation networks that transformed the alluvial plains into highly productive farmland. Archaeological surveys across southern Mesopotamia and the Diyala region reveal an increasingly elaborate system of canals, levees, and ditches designed to divert floodwaters and maintain soil fertility. These canals not only sustained staple crops but also enabled coordinated labor mobilization under institutional oversight, illustrating the direct link between environmental management and social organization. Barley, known as Se, functioned both as a primary staple and as a medium of exchange, forming the economic backbone of Sumerian society. Its cultivation was intensive and highly organized. Administrative tablets from Uruk and Lagash record field measurements in standardized units such as the IQ, along with detailed labor assignments for sowing, harvesting, and irrigation maintenance. Secondary crops, including date palms, flax, and assorted vegetables, along with domesticated livestock, diversified production, and supported growing urban populations. Evidence suggests that surplus production enabled the specialization of crafts, from pottery and textile weaving to metallurgy, which in turn reinforced social hierarchies and institutional authority. The temple and palace were central to the administration of agricultural surplus. Large-scale storage facilities and granaries have been excavated within temple precincts and palatial compounds. Cuneiform tablets document rationing systems, labor allocations, and redistributed produce. This institutional control allowed central authorities to stabilize food supply, manage seasonal labor, and underpin political legitimacy. Workers received standardized rations of barley, indicating a bureaucratic apparatus capable of detailed record-keeping and accountability. Such oversight exemplifies how economic management was inseparable from social hierarchy and governance. However, intensive irrigation carried long-term ecological consequences. The accumulation of salts in the soil salinization emerged as a persistent challenge in low-lying agricultural zones. Later administrative texts, including agrarian records from the Old Akkadian period, indicate declining wheat yields in certain regions, suggesting that over-irrigation and insufficient drainage gradually reduced arable productivity. These environmental stresses highlight the delicate balance between human intervention and natural conditions, showing that Sumerian agricultural success required both technological innovation and careful planning. Population growth in the early dynastic period can be traced archaeologically through expanding settlement footprints and cemetery data. Concentration of inhabitants near canals facilitated labor mobilization for both agriculture and infrastructure maintenance. Centralized control of water distribution allowed authorities to direct seasonal labor, coordinate planting cycles, and respond to environmental fluctuations. The correlation between irrigation management and social order demonstrates that Sumerian elites derived power directly from their ability to regulate essential resources. The organization of fields, canals, and labor illustrates early forms of institutionalized economic governance. Tablets indicate that surplus allocation followed complex procedures involving temple and palace intermediaries. The standardization of measurements and quotas not only enabled efficient distribution but also created a record of accountability, facilitating taxation and long-term planning. These practices laid the groundwork for increasingly sophisticated economic administration that would support intercity trade and regional integration in subsequent centuries. Agricultural surplus also provided the foundation for craft specialization and urban expansion. The ability to sustain non-farming populations allowed for the development of workshops, artisans, and professional scribes. Pottery kilns, textile looms, and metalworking facilities clustered near urban centers, producing goods for both domestic consumption and long-distance exchange. This productive surplus underpinned social stratification, reinforcing the authority of temple and palace elites who controlled both the means of production and the distribution of essential resources. The canal systems themselves were both practical and symbolic instruments of control. Maintenance required collective labor, coordinated over seasonal cycles, and recorded meticulously in cuneiform accounts. Disputes over canal rights and boundary markers, as seen in later conflicts between Lagash and Umma, reflect the critical role of irrigation in political stability. Control over water equated to control over life itself, linking ecology, economy, and governance in a single integrated system. By 2600 BCE, the cumulative effect of irrigation intensification and agricultural surplus was evident. Cities could support larger populations, sustain craft specialization, and engage in trade beyond local limits. Regional connectivity increased as surplus allowed Sumerian settlements to procure timber, stone, and metals absent from the alluvial plain. Administrative innovations tied to irrigation management became templates for broader economic organization, illustrating the deep interdependence of ecology and institutional authority. The intensification of agricultural production thus represents the ecological and economic foundation of Sumerian urban complexity. Surplus barley, managed through sophisticated canal networks and institutional oversight, enabled population growth, craft specialization, and political consolidation. Temples and palaces exercised control over labor and resources, embedding social hierarchy within economic practice. Surplus production allowed Sumerian cities to look beyond their resource-poor landscape, laying the groundwork for trade, regional integration, and the expansion of political authority explored in the following sections. From the Persian Gulf to the Indus Valley, Sumer was never isolated. Despite the fertility of the alluvial plains, southern Mesopotamia lacked essential raw materials such as timber, stone, and high-quality metals. This scarcity compelled city-states like Uruk, Lagash, and Uruk to develop extensive long-distance trade networks, connecting them with distant regions across the Persian Gulf and beyond. Administrative tablets from Uruk and Lagash document transactions with lands identified as Dilmun, modern Bahrain, Magan, Oman, and Maluha, the Indus Valley civilization, revealing a sophisticated awareness of geopolitical landscapes extending hundreds of kilometers from Sumer. Archaeological evidence corroborates these textual references. Excavations in Uruk have yielded Indus-style seals, carnelian beads, and faience ornaments, all demonstrating importation from Maluha. Inscriptions from the early dynastic and Akkadian periods record copper shipments from Magan and diorite from Oman, indicating the high value of these resources for construction, statuary, and luxury goods. Such imports reflect both the demand for durable materials and the capacity of Sumerian institutions to organize long-distance acquisition and distribution. Maritime trade likely relied on reed and wooden vessels navigating the Persian Gulf, while overland caravan routes facilitated the transport of goods from intermediary centers. Cylinder seals depict merchants, boats laden with cargo, and convoy transport, highlighting the logistical sophistication required for sustained exchange. These depictions indicate that trade was not ad hoc. It involved systematic planning, resource allocation, and the coordination of labor across multiple urban centers. Temple and palace institutions played a central role in regulating commerce. Administrative tablets record consignments, taxes, and allocations of imported goods, emphasizing institutional oversight. The temples of Uruk and Lagash frequently organized shipments for redistribution, linking ritual practice with economic function. Yet private merchants, identified in cuneiform as damgar, also participated, operating as intermediaries under institutional supervision. This dual system of state-directed and private enterprise illustrates the complexity of early commercial organization. Trade facilitated cultural as well as material exchange. The presence of Indus seals and standardized weights in Mesopotamian cities suggests shared measurement conventions and the adoption of foreign stylistic motifs. These interactions likely contributed to the spread of technologies, craft techniques, and administrative knowledge. Maritime trade through Dilmun and Magan provided not only metal and stone but also reinforced diplomatic and religious connections, as commercial activity often accompanied ritual offerings and elite exchange. Economic records indicate that imported commodities were integrated into both secular and religious domains. Copper and diorite were used in palace and temple construction, statuary, and ceremonial objects, while beads, shells, and exotic stones were often dedicated as votive offerings. The management of these materials required administrative precision, reinforcing the role of scribes and temple officials in overseeing long-distance transactions. By controlling both acquisition and allocation, institutions solidified political authority and centralized economic power. Trade networks also encouraged technological innovation. Shipbuilding, navigation, and storage techniques evolved to accommodate long voyages and the transport of perishable goods. The emergence of standardized weights and measures facilitated equitable exchange and reduced disputes over quantity and quality. These practices laid the foundation for accounting systems that extended beyond local production to regional and interregional commerce, linking economic administration with early globalization. The integration of Sumer into broader trade networks had demographic and social implications. Cities on trade routes, including Uruk, and Larsa, experienced increased population density as merchants, artisans, and laborers congregated around centers of exchange. Temple and palace authorities leveraged this concentration to coordinate workforce deployment, manage storage, and maintain security along trade corridors. This spatial organization reinforced social hierarchy and institutional authority, tying economic prosperity to centralized governance. Importantly, trade was both a driver and a reflection of political power. City-states with access to maritime routes or strategic overland connections could project influence beyond their immediate hinterlands. Conversely, control over trade networks became a point of contention among rival polities. Diplomatic negotiation, tribute, and military action were all intertwined with commerce, indicating that economic reach directly affected political legitimacy and territorial ambition. By 2300 BCE, Sumerian city-states were deeply integrated into a complex web of regional exchange. The flow of raw materials, luxury goods, and cultural artifacts facilitated urban growth, supported craft specialization, and reinforced the authority of both temples and palaces. Importantly, long-distance trade fostered a shared economic vocabulary, standardized measures, and bureaucratic practices, reflecting the early institutionalization of interregional commerce. As exchange networks expanded, Sumerian institutions adapted their systems of value, accounting, and administration. Cuneiform writing evolved to record transactions over vast distances, weights and measures were standardized, and temple economies integrated imports into local production and redistribution. This capacity to manage far-reaching trade laid the groundwork for the increasingly complex economic and political structures that would dominate Sumerian civilization in subsequent centuries. Innovation in motion transformed Sumerian productivity. By the mid-4th millennium BCE, Sumerians were implementing transformative technologies that reshaped agriculture, transport, and commerce. Archaeological evidence from Uruk, including cylinder seals and pictographs, depicts wheeled carts and early vehicles dating to approximately 3500 BCE. These early wheels, likely used for both cargo transport and labor-intensive tasks, reduced the physical constraints of overland movement, enabling more efficient movement of goods between settlements, fields, and urban centers. The introduction of wheeled vehicles represents one of the earliest examples of mechanized logistical innovation in human history. In agriculture, the Ard plow revolutionized cultivation. Unlike simple digging sticks, the plow allowed farmers to break and aerate heavier soils, increasing yield potential and reducing labor intensity. Excavations and depictions in pictorial artifacts suggest that the plow became standard equipment across southern Mesopotamia by the early dynastic period. Its use facilitated the expansion of irrigated fields, supporting the intensification of grain production that underpinned urban growth and surplus management. The combination of wheel-based transport and enhanced tillage created a feedback loop, increasing both agricultural productivity and the capacity to mobilize surplus. Maritime engineering complemented overland transport. Sumerian cities along the Tigris and Euphrates developed reed and wooden vessels, including barges capable of carrying bulk commodities such as grain, timber, and construction stone. Evidence from both pictographic depictions and administrative tablets indicates the systematic use of riverine transport for trade, construction projects, and military logistics. The ability to move heavier cargo efficiently over water facilitated the importation of scarce raw materials, such as timber from the Zagros and metals from Magan, and allowed cities to engage in interregional exchange networks with unprecedented scale. Technological integration enhanced military mobility as well. Wheeled chariots and transport carts enabled rapid deployment of troops and supplies, while boats allowed the projection of force along river corridors. Although warfare remained primarily infantry-based during this period, logistical improvements contributed to sustained campaigns and the capacity to enforce control over contested regions. These innovations also reinforced hierarchical organization, as institutional authorities oversaw construction, maintenance, and deployment of equipment. Material culture demonstrates the diffusion and standardization of these technologies. Cylinder seals, relief carvings, and administrative artifacts reveal repeated motifs of carts, plows, and vessels, suggesting widespread familiarity and institutional integration. Specialized workshops produced wheels, plow components, and boat materials, reflecting both craft specialization and coordination between economic, technological, and religious institutions. Temples and palaces played a role in provisioning, oversight, and maintenance of key tools, linking technological innovation to centralized authority. The interplay between transport, agriculture, and maritime engineering had profound economic implications. Efficient grain transport enabled redistribution from surplus zones to urban centers, supporting larger populations and sustaining craft specialization. Import of stone and metals facilitated monumental construction and tool production. The capacity to move goods over distance accelerated trade, connected disparate city-states, and reinforced interregional economic networks. Technological improvements thus amplified the productivity of both labor and land, creating tangible leverage over environmental constraints. Standardization was critical to technological utility. Field measurements, wagon dimensions, and vessel capacities were recorded and regulated through administrative oversight. This precision enabled consistent use across multiple sites and coordinated planning of transport and agricultural schedules. In turn, reliance on written documentation encouraged the expansion of cuneiform literacy, linking practical technology with intellectual administration. By 2300 BCE, wheeled transport, the Ard plow, and riverine vessels were embedded in the infrastructure of Sumerian civilization. They facilitated surplus production, trade, military organization, and urban expansion. The synergy between mechanical innovation and administrative control illustrates the Sumerians' capacity to leverage technology systematically to extend environmental and logistical reach. Technological growth during this period laid the foundation for intellectual developments in mathematics, surveying, and record-keeping. Numerical systems, standard units, and metrological practices emerged in part to optimize plowing, measurement of field areas, and load capacities for carts and boats. These advances demonstrate that technological and intellectual innovations were mutually reinforcing, enabling Sumerian city-states to manage complex economies, mobilize labor, and sustain both urban and interregional networks. Sumer measured the world in 60s. By the mid-3rd millennium BCE, Sumerian scribes had developed a sophisticated sexagesimal, or base 60, numerical system that formed the foundation for both practical administration and intellectual inquiry. This system allowed for precise calculations in accounting, land measurement, and construction, reflecting the integration of abstract mathematics into the daily management of city-states such as Uruk, Lagash, and Uruk. Clay tablets from this period record complex computations for grain distribution, labor allocation, and temple offerings, demonstrating that numerical literacy was essential for both secular and religious administration. Archaeological finds reveal that Sumerians applied geometry to practical problems, including field division and canal construction. Tablets depict calculations for area, volume, and proportion, enabling precise allocation of land units, measured in IQ, and optimization of irrigation networks. These mathematical practices ensured equitable distribution of resources and informed taxation strategies, highlighting the direct link between numerical abstraction and governance. Standardized measures also facilitated trade and intercity transactions, reinforcing the importance of arithmetic knowledge for economic integration. The sexagesimal system extended beyond accounting into architectural and engineering applications. Construction of temples, ziggurats, and city walls required accurate measurements of length, area, and volume. Builders used geometric calculations to ensure proportionality and structural integrity. Clay tablets from Uruk include exercises in geometric ratios and problem-solving, illustrating that scribal training encompassed both theoretical and applied mathematics. This educational framework produced a literate administrative class capable of managing complex urban infrastructure. Mathematical literacy also underpinned the emerging system of timekeeping. The division of the day into 24 hours, each subdivided into 60 minutes, and the circle into 360 degrees, derives directly from Sumerian sexagesimal calculations. Such standardization allowed for calendrical observation, scheduling of agricultural tasks, and coordination of ritual festivals. The integration of temporal measurement into civic life reflects the broader role of mathematics as a tool for structuring both human and environmental rhythms. Scribal schools, or Dubba, facilitated the transmission of mathematical knowledge. Students practiced exercises in calculation, geometry, and metrology alongside training in cuneiform writing. Tablets reveal structured curricula, including numerical tables and problem sets designed to develop computational proficiency. This institutionalized education ensured that administrative personnel could apply arithmetic accurately to both temple and palace responsibilities, reinforcing social and economic hierarchies through intellectual specialization. The sexagesimal system also enabled complex accounting for long-distance trade. Calculations for imports from Dilmun, Magan, and Meluhha required consistent weights and measures, with standardized numerical frameworks allowing temples and palaces to manage commodity flows efficiently. Administrative tablets demonstrate meticulous tracking of quantities, rations, and resource allocations, illustrating how abstract numeracy underpinned economic stability and institutional control. Geometry and arithmetic were further applied to astronomical observation. Records of lunar cycles, planetary motion, and celestial events were encoded using sexagesimal calculations, linking scientific observation to calendrical management. These practices informed agricultural planning, festival scheduling, and religious ritual, demonstrating that intellectual innovation served practical governance while fostering a deeper understanding of the natural world. The integration of mathematics into daily administration exemplifies the broader Sumerian approach to problem-solving. Abstract principles were directly applied to social, economic, and environmental challenges. Numerical literacy enhanced the precision of labor management, resource allocation, and infrastructure development, supporting the emergence of complex urban society. The sexagesimal system's durability is evident in its adoption by later Mesopotamian civilizations, including the Babylonians, reflecting its foundational significance. By enabling precise measurement of land, time, and material resources, mathematics became a central pillar of Sumerian institutional authority. It facilitated efficient governance, supported trade and construction, and structured ritual and civic life. The intellectual achievements of Sumerian scribes demonstrate that abstract calculation was inseparable from practical administration, illustrating the early integration of science and society. As numerical and geometric systems matured, writing expanded beyond accounting into literature, mythology, and codified law. Sumerians began recording epic narratives, hymns, and proverbs, marking the transition from purely administrative literacy to broader cultural and intellectual expression. This development set the stage for the rich literary tradition explored in subsequent chapters, in which the interplay of writing, mathematics, and societal organization shaped the intellectual foundation of Sumerian civilization. One ruler attempted to restrain institutional excess. Around 2350 BCE, Uruk of Lagash enacted a series of reforms aimed at curbing abuses by temple authorities and reducing exploitation by the elite. Archaeological and epigraphic evidence, though fragmentary, reveals that these measures sought to protect vulnerable populations, including widows, orphans, and smallholders, from predatory practices. Inscriptions describe limits on excessive taxation, seizure of property, and forced labor imposed by powerful officials, suggesting an unprecedented attempt to codify social protections within a city-state context. The reforms of Uruk also addressed economic administration. He restricted the ability of temple functionaries to appropriate surplus goods and clarified procedures for dispute resolution, implying both moral and bureaucratic oversight. By regulating offerings, labor allocations, and trade transactions associated with religious institutions, Uruk reinforced the principle that civic welfare and economic fairness could coexist with ritual obligation. These measures were recorded on clay tablets and stone inscriptions, indicating a deliberate effort to communicate the reforms publicly and to institutionalize accountability. Social hierarchy and governance structures were directly affected. Priests and nobles had previously exercised broad discretion over resources, often exploiting their positions for personal gain. Uruk edicts curtailed arbitrary power, setting standards for equitable treatment and establishing a precedent for codified law in southern Mesopotamia. The reforms also emphasized transparency and accountability, reflecting the early development of legal consciousness in the city-state framework. While largely successful within Lagash, Uruk reforms had limited reach beyond the city. Other polities, including neighboring Umma and continued practices of elite privilege and resource extraction, demonstrating the challenge of implementing uniform standards across fragmented Sumerian polities. Nonetheless, these initiatives illustrate the capacity of rulers to exercise moral and legal authority, foreshadowing later codifications such as the Eannatum and Hammurabi law codes. The reforms had both symbolic and practical significance. By publicly restricting elite privilege and prioritizing protections for marginalized groups, Uruk reinforced his legitimacy and moral authority. Temple archives and administrative tablets reflect the operational changes, including adjustments to labor obligations, redistribution of surplus, and constraints on ceremonial offerings. These administrative shifts strengthened central control while attempting to balance ritual obligations with social equity. Uruk legislation also influenced civic administration. By formalizing procedures for dispute resolution and economic management, he enhanced bureaucratic efficiency and set a standard for future governance. The reforms demonstrate a conscious alignment between political authority, legal frameworks, and social stability, highlighting the interplay between leadership, administration, and societal welfare. Despite these achievements, internal reform could not insulate Lagash from external pressures. Regional rivalries, competition for resources, and the ambitions of neighboring polities continued to shape political trajectories. Uruk policies, while pioneering in principle, were insufficient to prevent military confrontations or the eventual incorporation of Lagash into broader territorial expansions. This dynamic underscores the limits of internal governance when confronted with the external imperatives of power and conquest. The significance of Uruk reforms lies in their codification and their integration into urban administration. These measures represent one of the earliest known attempts to formalize legal protections and limit institutional abuse, situating Lagash as a laboratory for early civic reform. In doing so, Uruk governance provides insight into the challenges and possibilities of managing complex, hierarchical societies in early Mesopotamia. By the mid-3rd millennium BCE, the interplay between internal reform and external pressures would shape the political landscape of Sumer, paving the way for attempts at unification and the emergence of larger territorial states explored in subsequent sections. For a brief moment, Sumer stood united. Around 2350 BCE, Lugul-Zagizi, ruler of Umma, embarked on a campaign that brought much of southern Mesopotamia under his control. Inscriptions from his reign assert authority, from the Lower Sea to the Upper Sea, referring to the Persian Gulf and the northern reaches of the Tigris and Euphrates. Archaeological evidence, including building inscriptions and administrative tablets, confirms that Lugul-Zagizi's forces conquered Lagash and exerted influence over Uruk, and neighboring city-states. This achievement represents the first recorded large-scale attempt at territorial unification in Sumerian history, consolidating previously fragmented polities under a single sovereign. Lugul-Zagizi's expansion relied on both military and administrative strategies. Contemporary inscriptions describe organized campaigns, the fortification of captured cities, and the installation of loyal governors to oversee local administration. These measures ensured that newly subjugated territories contributed tribute, resources, and labor to the central authority. Temple archives indicate that religious institutions were integrated into his governance framework, facilitating both economic oversight and ideological legitimacy. Control over surplus grain, craft production, and water management reinforced centralized power and enabled the ruler to project influence across a broader region. The unification also had significant symbolic and political dimensions. By conquering Lagash, long a rival of Umma, Lugul-Zagizi not only secured economic resources but also asserted supremacy over traditional intercity rivalries. Royal inscriptions depict the king as divinely sanctioned, portraying military success as the fulfillment of cosmic order. Standardized administration, coupled with religious endorsement, allowed him to extend authority over multiple urban centers without dismantling their essential civic structures. This approach highlights the Sumerian model of integration, balancing coercion with institutional continuity. Despite the initial success, Lugal's unification was fragile. The alliance of southern city-states rested on the personal authority of a single ruler, without a deeply institutionalized bureaucratic framework capable of sustaining cohesion beyond his reign. As a result, northern challengers could exploit weaknesses in the centralized structure. Administrative tablets reveal continued local autonomy in taxation, canal maintenance, and temple oversight, suggesting that unification was more a hegemonic projection than a fully integrated state apparatus. The campaign also had economic and logistical implications. Mobilizing forces to conquer multiple city-states required coordination of surplus provisions, transport, and labor. Military expeditions depended on wheeled vehicles, riverine transport, and well-maintained roads, demonstrating the integration of technological infrastructure into political strategy. Control over long-distance trade routes, particularly toward Dilmun, Magan, and Maluha, enhanced the ruler's economic leverage, providing both prestige goods and critical resources for sustaining authority. Lugal's consolidation influenced subsequent concepts of kingship. His inscriptions present the ruler as the arbiter of justice, protector of the weak, and executor of divine will. By combining military success with ideological messaging, he established a precedent for territorial sovereignty that later Mesopotamian rulers would emulate. The unification demonstrates the interplay between military capability, economic control, and religious legitimation in early state formation. However, the durability of this unification was limited. Northern forces, most notably Sargon of Akkad, recognized both the strategic and symbolic value of controlling southern Sumer. Lugal's reliance on personal authority and ad hoc administrative networks left the polity vulnerable to external conquest. Within decades, his domain was challenged and ultimately absorbed into the emergent Akkadian state, signaling the transient nature of southern consolidation. The significance of Lugal's reign lies in the conceptual shift it represents. For the first time, multiple Sumerian city-states were brought under a single ruler's authority, establishing a model for superregional governance. The integration of military conquest, administrative oversight, and religious sanction illustrates the methods by which early rulers sought to transcend the traditional independence of urban centers. By consolidating southern Sumer, Lugal's set the stage for the northern Akkadian expansion that would transform Mesopotamian political structures. This episode highlights both the potential and fragility of early territorial unification, demonstrating how ambition, infrastructure, and ideology combined to create the first attempts at centralized statehood in Sumer. Akkad transformed city-states into empire. Around 2334 BCE, Sargon of Akkad defeated Lugal's of Umma, overthrowing southern unification to establish the Akkadian Empire, the first documented superregional polity in Mesopotamia. Inscriptions from his reign, including the victory stele of Sargon and royal yearnames, record campaigns that extended Akkadian authority across the Tigris-Euphrates plain and into the Zagros Mountains and Anatolia. Sargon's military innovations, combined with political acumen, allowed him to integrate previously independent Sumerian city-states into a cohesive imperial structure, centralizing both economic and ritual authority while retaining local governance mechanisms to maintain urban stability. The consolidation of city-states under Sargon involved both force and administrative integration. Archaeological evidence shows standardized fortifications, administrative archives, and coordinated canal and road maintenance projects throughout conquered territories. Temple and palace institutions were co-opted into the imperial bureaucracy, ensuring that economic production and resource allocation, including surplus grain and craft goods, were managed centrally. By incorporating religious authorities into governance, Sargon reinforced legitimacy while simultaneously consolidating material control over both labor and resources. Linguistic innovation was also central to imperial cohesion. Akkadian became the administrative language, recorded on clay tablets for legal, economic, and diplomatic purposes, while Sumerian remained the liturgical and scholarly language. Bilingual inscriptions, including correspondence preserved at Nippur and other sites, illustrate the dual use of language to maintain cultural continuity and operational efficiency. This linguistic policy enabled uniform record-keeping across the empire while respecting local ritual traditions. Sargon's campaigns demonstrate a sophisticated approach to military and logistical organization. Year names, inscriptions, and chronicles describe extended marches, river crossings, and coordinated supply lines. Wheeled vehicles, riverine barges, and fortified garrisons allowed sustained operations far beyond the home city of Akkad. The ability to project force over such distances required integration of technological, economic, and administrative systems, reflecting a complex understanding of statecraft and infrastructure. Imperial control also entailed the standardization of taxation and tribute. Tablets from Lagash, Uruk, and Nippur indicate systematic collection of grain, textiles, and metals for redistribution and royal consumption. These mechanisms facilitated both urban support and military provisioning. By regulating surplus through temple and palace networks, the Akkadian administration maintained economic stability while reinforcing hierarchical authority. Central oversight of irrigation maintenance further emphasized the intertwining of ecological management and imperial power. The integration of conquered city-states preserved local institutions while embedding them in a broader imperial framework. Governors loyal to Akkad were installed, yet traditional civic structures, including councils of elders and temple administrations, continued to function under oversight. This hybrid model enabled Sargon to exercise control without complete disruption of local practices, ensuring continuity in ritual, economic, and social life while extending imperial influence. Sargon's empire also established precedents for diplomacy and interregional exchange. Trade networks expanded under imperial supervision, linking Mesopotamia with Anatolia, the Levant, and the Iranian plateau. Administrative tablets and cylinder seals document shipments of timber, metals, and luxury goods, illustrating the empire's role in facilitating both commerce and political integration. By controlling the flow of resources, the Akkadian state strengthened both economic and symbolic authority across its territories. The rise of the Akkadian Empire marked a transformation in political organization. Whereas Sumerian city-states had relied primarily on local autonomy and episodic alliances, Sargon implemented continuous centralized oversight and hierarchical governance. Military campaigns, economic regulation, and linguistic standardization combined to create an empire capable of sustaining authority across multiple cultural and ecological zones. This transition from local autonomy to imperial rule reshaped the landscape of Mesopotamian civilization, setting a model for subsequent empires. By consolidating political, economic, and religious structures under a central authority, Sargon ensured both territorial control and cultural continuity. His reign established the administrative templates, military logistics, and economic management practices that would characterize Mesopotamian imperial governance for centuries. The integration of conquered city-states into a cohesive imperial system illustrates the dynamic interplay of coercion, negotiation, and institutional development that defined early Akkadian rule. Imperial administration, enforced through a combination of military strength, economic oversight, and bureaucratic standardization, created unprecedented territorial cohesion. This framework facilitated resource mobilization, labor organization, and interregional connectivity, enabling the Akkadian state to sustain urban populations, craft specialization, and long-distance trade. By establishing centralized governance while respecting local ritual traditions, Sargon of Akkad transformed southern Mesopotamia from a landscape of fragmented city-states into the first enduring imperial polity. Empire required integration, not eradication. Following his military conquests, Sargon of Akkad implemented a bureaucratic system designed to consolidate control over diverse city-states while preserving essential local structures. Provincial governors, often appointed from loyal Akkadian administrators, replaced independent rulers in strategic locations, overseeing taxation, labor allocation, and maintenance of infrastructure such as canals, roads, and defensive walls. Archaeological evidence from sites like Nippur and Lagash indicates the presence of standardized record-keeping, including clay tablets detailing tribute, labor duties, and resource distribution, reflecting the administrative reach of the imperial center. Standardized taxation was central to sustaining both the central administration and military apparatus. Fields, craft workshops, and temple estates were assessed systematically, with surplus commodities, grain, textiles, and metals, collected and redistributed to support royal consumption, garrison maintenance, and trade expeditions. Military garrisons, strategically located along trade routes and near key watercourses, enforced compliance while providing rapid response capabilities in regions susceptible to revolt. Cylinder seals and administrative archives reveal detailed logistical planning, illustrating how imperial authority was reinforced through both economic and military structures. Cultural syncretism emerged as a deliberate policy to integrate Akkadian and Sumerian traditions. While Akkadian became the administrative language, Sumerian persisted in religious texts, temple archives, and literary composition. Temples remained central to local civic identity, yet ritual practices incorporated Akkadian deities alongside traditional Sumerian gods. Inscriptions from Lagash and Uruk document the installation of Akkadian officials within temple hierarchies, reflecting a blending of authority that balanced imperial oversight with local religious legitimacy. This fusion facilitated political stability by aligning centralized governance with existing cultural frameworks. The integration of legal, economic, and religious systems reinforced imperial cohesion. Provincial governors enforced standardized laws, regulated temple economies, and coordinated labor obligations, ensuring predictable operation across disparate territories. Administrative tablets demonstrate that measurement units, accounting methods, and distribution protocols were harmonized, enabling efficient resource management while maintaining continuity of local customs. This structured approach illustrates that the Akkadian Empire relied on sophisticated bureaucratic mechanisms rather than coercion alone. Economic networks were further strengthened through imperial oversight. Long-distance trade, previously managed largely by individual city-states and temple authorities, was coordinated centrally. Resources critical to construction, craft production, and military provisioning, such as timber from the Zagros, copper from Magan, and carnelian from Maluha, were mobilized efficiently, reflecting the empire's capacity to integrate regional economies. Trade also facilitated cultural exchange, as artisans, scribes, and administrators moved throughout the empire, contributing to the diffusion of technologies, artistic motifs, and linguistic practices. The fusion of administrative and cultural systems allowed Akkadian rulers to maintain authority over a multi-ethnic and multilingual population. Sumerian city-states retained a sense of civic identity while participating in a broader imperial framework. Temples functioned as centers of economic and ritual activity, integrating local elites into the imperial hierarchy. The balance of continuity and centralization mitigated potential resistance, demonstrating that empire building in Mesopotamia required negotiation with existing institutional and social structures. Despite these efforts, environmental and social pressures gradually challenged imperial cohesion. Records of canal maintenance indicate increasing difficulty in sustaining irrigation infrastructure, critical for both economic productivity and tax revenue. Simultaneously, rebellions and localized uprisings, documented in royal inscriptions, reveal the limits of bureaucratic control over distant provinces. These stresses would ultimately contribute to the weakening of Akkadian dominance in the later 3rd millennium BCE. By integrating provincial governance, standardized economic systems, and cultural synthesis, the Akkadian Empire established a model for imperial administration in Mesopotamia. Control was exerted not through eradication of local traditions, but through the careful incorporation of Sumerian civic and religious structures into a centralized bureaucratic framework. This approach allowed Sargon and his successors to govern a vast and diverse territory, demonstrating the interdependence of military power, economic management, and cultural legitimacy. Yet the reliance on environmental productivity, labor mobilization, and the compliance of local elites meant that the empire's stability remained contingent. Over time, these structural vulnerabilities, compounded by ecological stress and political dissent, would erode Akkadian authority, illustrating the limits of centralization in an early imperial context. Sumerian rule returned with administrative precision. Around 2112 BCE, Eannatum founded the 3rd dynasty of Ur, initiating a period of political consolidation and cultural revival often referred to as the Ur III Renaissance. His reign emphasized systematic governance, legal codification, and monumental construction, reflecting the dual priorities of administrative efficiency and ideological legitimacy. Excavations at UR reveal extensive archival records, including clay tablets detailing tax collection, labor obligations, and resource allocation, demonstrating the sophisticated bureaucratic apparatus developed under his authority. Eannatum's law code represents one of the earliest known examples of codified legal practice in Mesopotamia, predating the more famous Code of Hammurabi by over a century. The code outlines specific fines and penalties for a wide range of offenses, including property disputes, personal injury, and contractual violations. By specifying proportional punishment and establishing formal legal procedures, Eannatum sought to standardize justice and reduce arbitrary adjudication by local elites or temple authorities. Tablets bearing these laws were widely disseminated, emphasizing the ruler's role as guarantor of civic order and fairness. Monumental construction reinforced both practical and symbolic objectives. The Great Ziggurat of Ur, built under Eannatum's patronage, served as a religious center, administrative hub, and visual representation of dynastic authority. Archaeological evidence indicates that construction required organized labor mobilization, material procurement from distant regions, and coordinated project management. The ziggurat functioned not only as a temple platform but also as a tangible demonstration of centralized control over resources, labor, and religious ritual. The UR3 administration further strengthened central authority by formalizing provincial governance. Appointed governors oversaw taxation, canal maintenance, and local judicial matters, ensuring that urban and rural areas contributed effectively to the state's stability. Administrative tablets from Lagash, Umma, and Nippur record standardized measurement units, rations, and labor allotments, reflecting uniform procedures that facilitated predictability and efficiency across the empire. Temple estates remained integral to the economic system but operated under clear oversight, integrating religious institutions into the broader administrative framework. Economic management was closely tied to legal codification. Detailed accounting practices documented grain, livestock, textiles, and craft production, linking resource allocation directly to enforcement of laws and administrative oversight. The integration of legal, economic, and bureaucratic systems allowed Eannatum to maintain order, mobilize labor, and sustain urban populations. Surplus production supported construction projects, temple offerings, and the military, illustrating the interdependence of law, economy, and governance. The law code also reflects social stratification and protections. While it imposed penalties in a hierarchical framework, distinguishing between free citizens, dependent laborers, and slaves, it included provisions aimed at safeguarding property and regulating commercial transactions. This structure indicates an awareness of the need to balance elite authority with social stability, ensuring that urban and rural populations could operate within predictable legal parameters. Records suggest that enforcement was tied closely to provincial administrators, further embedding the legal system into the bureaucratic apparatus. Eannatum's reign illustrates the symbiosis between written law and administrative capacity. Legal texts codified expectations and obligations, while the bureaucratic system provided the mechanisms for enforcement. By recording fines, procedures, and responsibilities on clay tablets, the state created durable, replicable standards applicable across diverse regions. This dual system strengthened the ruler's legitimacy, underscored by monumental construction projects that visually and materially demonstrated the centralized power of UR3. The codification of law also served as a precedent for subsequent Sumerian and Mesopotamian states. The Eannatum Code introduced principles of proportional justice and formalized procedure, influencing the development of later legal systems, including the Code of Hammurabi. Its integration into administrative practice demonstrates that governance in UR3 was not solely military or economic but relied on structured, institutionalized frameworks to regulate daily life, commerce, and social relations. By standardizing law, centralizing administration, and directing monumental construction, Eannatum laid the foundation for a period of internal stability and cultural flourishing. His reign represents the culmination of centuries of political, technological, and intellectual development in Sumer, combining legal innovation with bureaucratic rigor. The practices established under Eannatum's authority enabled efficient resource management, coordinated labor mobilization, and sustained urban infrastructure, reinforcing the coherence of the third dynasty of Uruk. Centralization intensified under his successor, Shulgi, who expanded legal, administrative, and economic systems while consolidating imperial control. The structures and codifications established by Eannatum provided a durable framework for continued governance, ensuring that the administrative precision of Ur3 endured beyond the founder's reign and set a benchmark for later Mesopotamian states. The last Sumerian dynasty collapsed under foreign invasion. In 2004 BCE, Elamite forces from the Zagros Mountains captured Ur, bringing an abrupt end to the Ur3 dynasty. Archaeological evidence, including widespread destruction layers and abandoned administrative tablets, indicates a rapid breakdown of the centralized bureaucracy that had governed southern Mesopotamia for over a century. Provincial governors either fled or were replaced, and temple and palace networks that had coordinated labor, taxation, and resource redistribution disintegrated. The fall of Ur marked the end of organized Sumerian political authority, with power gradually shifting to emerging Amorite dynasties in regions such as Isin and Larsa, whose rulers would continue the patterns of urban administration in adapted forms. The collapse of Ur reflects both external and internal pressures. Military incursions by the Elamites exploited vulnerabilities created by overextended supply lines, dependence on canal maintenance, and ecological stress, including soil salinization and fluctuating water levels in the Tigris-Euphrates system. Administrative tablets and royal inscriptions suggest that local unrest and declining compliance with labor and taxation obligations further undermined the central state. In combination, these factors eroded the cohesion of the Ur3 system, demonstrating the fragility inherent in highly centralized pre-industrial polities. Despite the political demise, many institutional, cultural, and technological innovations persisted. Administrative methods developed under Ur3, standardized record-keeping, taxation systems, and labor mobilization, were adopted by successor states, influencing Amorite rulers and later Babylonian governance. Cuneiform literacy, temple-centered economies, and the sexagesimal numerical system continued to structure economic, legal, and religious life across Mesopotamia. Monumental architecture, including ziggurats, remained a defining feature of civic identity, while Sumerian literary and religious texts were preserved and studied for centuries. The fall of Ur illustrates a critical transition in Mesopotamian history, the shift from native Sumerian dynasties to Amorite-led city-states, which combined inherited administrative frameworks with new dynastic ambitions. Regional integration, long-distance trade, and urban organization continued, demonstrating that while political authority was transient, the underlying systems of governance, writing, and cultural practice endured. These legacies shaped the intellectual, religious, and bureaucratic foundations of Mesopotamia well into the Old Babylonian period. By the early 2nd millennium BCE, the collapse of centralized Sumerian rule did not eliminate Sumerian influence. Instead, it was transformed and integrated into the political and cultural frameworks of subsequent empires. Successor dynasties utilized existing infrastructure, adopted Sumerian legal and administrative precedents, and preserved literary and religious traditions, ensuring that the achievements of Sumerian civilization remained embedded in Mesopotamian identity. This continuity highlights the resilience of institutional and cultural innovation even in the face of military conquest and dynastic change. If you've followed this journey from the first Sumerian city-states to the fall of Ur and the survival of their language, take a moment to support the channel. Subscribe for more full-length, chronologically structured deep dives into ancient history. Like the video to help others discover it. And in the comments, tell me, what surprised you most about Sumer? Their laws, their bureaucracy, or the survival of their language long after their empire fell?